You're JC. The pie slipped from her hands and hit the porch floor. Apple's crust, 2 years of loneliness, all of it shattering at once. She had read his letters in bed at midnight. She had cried over his words in the orchard, where no one could hear her. She had fallen in love with a man she believed lived 100 miles away, and he was standing 6 feet in front of her, looking just as wrecked as she felt. He knew about the nightmares. He knew she cried in the orchard. He knew things about her that her own neighbors never would. And he had been next door the entire time. If you've ever believed a stranger could know your soul before they knew your name, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to the channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hannah Whitmore had exactly 2 rules about mornings. First, coffee before conversation. Second, never let anyone see you cry before sunrise. She'd been breaking the second rule for 2 years. Not loudly, not in ways anyone else could see, just the kind of quiet, private grief that settles into a person the way winter settles into old bones, deep, stubborn, and slow to leave. She would stand at her kitchen window, with her cup watching the light come up over the east ridge, and she would miss Thomas so specifically that it almost felt like company. She missed the sound of his boots on the porch steps. She missed the way he drank his coffee too fast and always burned the roof of his mouth and never once learned from it. She missed having someone in the house who cared whether she'd eaten. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days since the accident. She'd stopped counting after the first year, then started again without meaning to. Cedar Creek, Montana Territory, in the summer of 1888, was not a kind place to be a young widow. It was not cruel exactly. The townspeople were not monsters, but there was a particular flavor of sympathy that began to sour after a certain point. A look that shifted from, "we feel for you," to, "what are you going to do about your situation?" Margaret Hollis at the dry goods store had started asking pointed questions about whether Hannah had considered any of the eligible men who'd come through with the spring cattle drives. Reverend Dawes had delivered 2 separate sermons about God's intention for companionship that Hannah was fairly certain were directed at her personally. Even her closest neighbor, elderly Mrs. Perkins, 4 miles south, had taken to saying things like, "You can't run that place alone forever, sweetheart. Something's got to give." Hannah smiled at all of them. She thanked them for their concern, and she went home and checked her fences and fed her chickens and did exactly what she always did. She ran the place alone. Because the alternative was to admit they were right, and she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready for a lot of things. What she hadn't told a single living soul in Cedar Creek, not Margaret Hollis, not Reverend Dawes, not even Mrs. Perkins, was that she had not spent the last 10 months entirely alone inside her own head. There had been letters. It had started the previous September, almost by accident. Hannah had placed a small notice in the Frontier Correspondent, a regional newspaper that ran a section for isolated homesteaders to exchange practical information. She'd written about a technique she used to protect her apple trees from early frost, and she'd included her post office address in case anyone had questions. 2 weeks later, she received a reply. It wasn't about apple trees. The writer, who signed only with the initials JC, said he'd read her note and wanted to ask not about frost protection, but about something she'd written in the final line. She'd ended the note with, "There is something about tending a living thing through winter that makes a person feel less alone." He wrote, "I read that line 3 times. I don't think I've ever seen someone put that feeling into words before." How long have you been doing it, making yourself feel less alone by keeping things alive? Hannah had stared at that letter for a long time. Then she sat down and wrote back. She told him about Thomas. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. She told him that her husband had died and that she'd thrown herself into the orchard because standing still felt like drowning. She told him that she was fine mostly, that she didn't need anyone to worry about her. JC wrote back within the week. "I'm not worried about you," he said. "You sound like someone who knows exactly how to survive. I'm more curious about whether surviving is enough for you, because it hasn't been enough for me, and I've been doing it for 4 years. That was the letter that changed something, because no one had ever asked her that before. Not once in 2 years and 3 months and 11 days. Everyone asked if she was managing. Everyone asked if she needed help with the harvest, or the roof, or the water pump. No one had ever looked straight at her, even through paper and ink, and asked if merely surviving was what she actually wanted. She'd written back 4 pages. She hadn't meant to. It just kept coming. By November, they were exchanging letters every 2 weeks. By January, every week. By spring, she was checking the post office in Cedar Creek more urgently than she checked anything else, including the weather. She knew things about JC that felt intimate in ways she couldn't fully explain. She knew he'd lost someone, a wife, he said, and something more that he didn't name directly, but that she understood from the shape of the silence around it. She knew he worked cattle that he'd spent years moving from drive to drive as a kind of self-imposed exile from a life he hadn't figured out how to rebuild. She knew he was 36, that he'd grown up in Wyoming, that he drank his coffee black, that he talked to his horse when he thought no one was listening, and that he had a particular tenderness for stubborn, difficult things. Difficult land, difficult weather, difficult people who didn't know how to ask for help. She knew somehow that she was one of those difficult people he was describing, and she suspected he knew it too. What she did not know was his last name. She did not know what he looked like. She did not know precisely where in the West he lived. He didn't know those things about her either. They had agreed early on, without quite discussing it formally, just the gradual mutual understanding of 2 private people, that the letters were safer without those details. That there was something honest about writing to a stranger you'd never have to face. That the words could be more true if there was nothing at stake. At least, that was what she told herself. She did not let herself examine what it meant that she had started sleeping better after his letters arrived. She did not examine what it meant that she'd laughed, actually laughed out loud alone in her kitchen, at something he'd written about a particularly stubborn bull and a fence post, and his own spectacular failure to come out ahead in that situation. She did not examine the fact that she had started writing drafts of her letters before writing the final versions, which was something she had never done for anything in her life, not even the legal notices she'd filed after Thomas died. She told herself it was just correspondence. It was companionship. It was practical. She told herself that right up until the morning, the abandoned Callahan place next door suddenly had smoke coming from the chimney. Hannah noticed it while she was out checking on her chickens just after dawn. The old Callahan homestead had sat empty for the better part of 3 years. The previous owner had left under circumstances that nobody in Cedar Creek agreed on. Some said debt, some said family trouble, some said he'd just gotten tired of fighting Montana winters and given up. The house was still solid, the barn in decent repair, but the land had gone to scrub and the fences needed work. She'd grown accustomed to it being empty. There was a particular quality of silence that came from an abandoned place, and she'd absorbed it into her own routine without quite realizing it. The empty ranch had felt in some small way like privacy. So the smoke surprised her. She stood there in the morning cold with a bucket of feed, watching the thin gray thread rise from the chimney of the neighboring house, and she felt something she hadn't expected, not curiosity, not even annoyance, but a low, quiet unease she couldn't account for. Like the ground had shifted 2 inches to the left, and she hadn't quite found her footing yet. She went inside and had her coffee, eyed. She told herself she'd wait a few days before going over, give whoever it was time to settle. She didn't want to be the kind of neighbor who descended the moment someone arrived, demanding to know their business. She lasted exactly 1 day, because Hannah Whitmore had been raised to believe that a good neighbor showed up with food, and that rule didn't bend, regardless of her own discomfort. So the following morning, she got up before light, made her best apple pie, the one with the brown sugar and the hint of cinnamon that Thomas had always said was the finest thing she ever produced, and she walked across the field to the neighboring ranch to introduce herself. She was not nervous. She told herself she was absolutely not nervous. She knocked on the door. The man who answered was not what she'd expected. She hadn't known what she expected exactly. Some grizzled older rancher maybe. Someone weathered and quiet. She'd imagined a type without a face. She had not imagined someone who looked like he'd just come in from a long ride with dust still on his shirt, and eyes that registered surprise, and then something stranger than surprise, something she didn't have a word for. The moment he saw her, she had not imagined someone who looked at her like he already knew her. "Good morning," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which she would later consider one of her finer accomplishments. "I'm Hannah Whitmore. I have the farm next east. I wanted to welcome you to the property." She held out the pie. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not take it immediately, which was unusual, and his expression did something complicated that she couldn't read. "Hannah Whitmore," he said. Not hello, not thank you. Just her name repeated back to her in a tone that made every hair on her arm stand straight up. "That's right," she said carefully. "And you are—" There was a pause of a very specific kind, not the pause of someone trying to remember their own name, but the pause of someone deciding something. "Jacob Callahan," he said. "J.C." The pie hit the ground. She would not be able to reconstruct exactly what happened in the next 30 seconds. She knew that she said something. She believed it was probably the word "what" or possibly just an inarticulate sound that occupied the same general territory. She knew that her hands, which had been holding the pie, were suddenly empty. She knew that her heart was doing something it had no business doing at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. Jacob Callahan. J.C. looked down at the pie on his porch and then back up at her, and his face had gone from complicated to something much simpler, stricken. "The apple trees," he said. It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes for 3 full seconds. He had read her first letter, the one about the frost and the orchard, and making yourself feel less alone. Of course he had. Because the frontier correspondent covered this region. Because he was her neighbor. Because, of course, of all the "you never said where you lived," she said. Her voice had gone very flat. Careful the way she got when she was holding something large and breakable. "Neither did you." His voice was the same. She recognized it somehow, the steadiness of someone who had practice at keeping themselves very still when the ground moved. "You could have—" She stopped. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know it was you. I didn't know you were— I thought you were somewhere further west. You never mentioned Cedar Creek by name. I said I was in Montana Territory. So did I." They stared at each other. Hannah became aware very slowly that she was standing on a stranger's porch, having a conversation that no one in Cedar Creek, or possibly in all of Montana Territory, could have made sense of if they'd witnessed it. She and this man had exchanged the most honest words she'd spoken since Thomas died. He knew about her nightmares. He knew she sometimes cried in the orchard because it was the only place she felt far enough from the house that no one would hear. He knew she was angry still. Quietly, stubbornly angry about the way Thomas had died, about the unanswered questions about the documents that hadn't made sense. She knew things about him too. She knew about the wife, about what he'd lost beyond the wife that he'd never said outright. She knew he'd spent 3 years writing drives, not because he loved the work, but because stopping meant sitting still, and sitting still meant feeling it all. They were not strangers. They had never been strangers. They had just never had faces before. "You should come inside," he said finally. "I don't—" She looked at the pie on the porch boards. "I need to my chickens." "Your chickens were fine when you left them." She looked at him sharply. "How would you know that—" "Because you check them every morning at first light. I've been here 3 days. I've watched you do it." A beat. "You've been watching me," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort, but close. "I noticed a neighbor, that's all. I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know it was you. You keep saying that. Because it's true." His jaw was tight now. "I'm not sure what you want me to say, Mrs. Whitmore. I want you to say—" She stopped. What did she want him to say? She genuinely did not know. She was standing on a porch in the morning cold, with apple pie on the boards between them and the man who had read every honest thing she'd written in 10 months, was standing 4 feet away, looking like he was waiting for a verdict she didn't know how to deliver. "You could have told me you were investigating Thomas's death," she said. That landed. She saw it land. His expression didn't fall apart, but it changed, became more careful, more closed in the way of someone who has just been found out about something they were not ready to discuss. "I didn't have proof yet," he said. The ground moved again. She grabbed the porch railing. "What kind of proof?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. "What are you talking about?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside," he said. "Please, I'll make coffee." She should have left. Every sensible instinct she possessed told her to pick up what remained of her pie, thank him for his time, and walk back across the field to her own house, where things were comprehensible and under her control. She went inside. His kitchen was not what she expected. It was bare the way a man's kitchen got when he'd been living out of saddlebags for years. Functional, impersonal, nothing on the walls, a single mug by the wash basin. But there was a stack of papers on the table that she noticed immediately, the way you notice something that doesn't fit the room. Maps. And something that looked like ledger pages. She sat down at the table and waited while he built the fire up and set the coffee pot on. He didn't look at the papers. He was very specifically not looking at them, which meant he knew she'd seen them. "Start from the beginning," she said. He sat down across from her. He had the kind of stillness about him that she recognized from his letters measured deliberate nothing wasted. In person, it was more pronounced. Or maybe she just noticed it more because she was looking for it. "You wrote to me in February," he said, "that the documents your husband left were incomplete, that some of the land records didn't match what you expected, that there was a gap in the deed paperwork that his lawyer couldn't explain." I remember what I wrote. "I'd seen that gap before," he said. "Not on your property, somewhere else. Different name, different county, same pattern." She felt the hair on her arms rise again, and this time it stayed. "There was a surveyor," Jacob said. "I worked a drive last fall that passed through Blackwood territory. Victor Blackwood, the cattle syndicate out of Helena. One of the former surveyors who'd done work for Blackwood got drunk one night at a camp and started talking. He said the land records in 3 counties had been manipulated. Said he'd helped do it and hadn't slept right since. He didn't have documents, just talk. I didn't know what to do with it." "So you started looking." "I started looking," he agreed. "And then I got a letter from a widow in the Montana Territory who mentioned that her husband's land records hadn't made sense when he died, and I thought it was a coincidence." He paused. "I kept thinking it was a coincidence. For about 4 months I thought it was a coincidence." "And then?" "And then you mentioned the water rights." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Hannah's hands had gone very still on the table. She knew exactly which letter he meant. She'd written it in a moment of frustration. She'd been trying to clear up an old water access question with the county recorder's office and had run into a wall she didn't understand. She'd mentioned it almost in passing, buried in 3 paragraphs about the apple harvest. "Thomas was working on something," she said. "Before he died. He never told me exactly what, but he was upset. He was going through papers late at night. He died before he explained it to me." "I know," Jacob said quietly. "How much do you know?" He looked at her steadily. "Enough to think his death may not have been an accident." The world tilted. Hannah gripped the table edge. Not because she was about to faint, she was not the type who fainted, and she refused to start now, but because the room had become very loud inside her own head, and she needed something solid. She had thought it. She had thought it and buried it, and refused to think it again, because it was the kind of thought that had no bottom to it. And if you fell into it, you might not stop falling. Thomas had died when his horse threw him on the West Ridge Trail. That was what everyone said. That was what the county record said. Accident. Tragic, senseless accident. She had never fully believed it. She had never told anyone she didn't believe it. She had told J.C. She had told him in the letter in January, in one careful paragraph, that she'd almost torn up 3 times before sending because it seemed crazy. Because she had no proof. Because she was a widow, and widows imagined things when grief didn't have anywhere else to go. He had written back and said, "I don't think you're imagining it. I think you should keep the documents safe." She'd thought it was just kindness. Something to say. Jacob. She said his name for the first time, and the oddness of it, knowing him so well, and saying his name so differently than she'd imagined, made her voice rougher than she intended. "If you had evidence, or even the start of evidence, why didn't you tell me?" "Because if I'd told you in a letter," he said, "and the letter had been intercepted, you'd have been in danger. Because I didn't have enough to act on yet. Because—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "Because I was afraid it would change things." "Change what things?" He met her eyes. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere across the field, she could hear her chickens carrying on about something. "The letters," he said. "If you knew I was your neighbor, if you knew I was investigating your husband's death, you would have stopped writing." It was the most honest thing she'd heard anyone say in 2 years and 3 months. She sat with it for a moment. "Yes," she said finally. "I probably would have." He nodded. Not like it didn't hurt, she could see that it hurt, but like a man who had decided some time ago that honesty was the right answer, regardless of the cost. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we go through what I've found," he said, "and what you have from Thomas's papers. And we figure out if we have enough to take to a judge." He paused. "I think we might." She looked at the maps, at the ledger pages. "Victor Blackwood," she said. "He's been doing this for years," Jacob said. "You're not the only widow he's gone after. Just the one I have the most documentation for. Because of what you told me. Because of what Thomas left behind." Something tightened in her chest. Thomas, still trying to protect her, even gone. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady again. She'd found the floor. "Show me what you have." He pulled the papers toward the center of the table. They sat across from each other in the morning light. Two people who had known each other better than most people know their oldest friends, and who were still in every practical sense meeting for the first time. She did not leave until mid-afternoon, and when she walked back across the field to her own house, she realized she had not checked the time once, that she had forgotten to be careful, that she had just spent 7 hours with a man she'd supposedly just met talking about evidence and her dead husband and forged documents, and that none of it had felt strange. That all of it had felt against every reasonable expectation like something that was supposed to happen. She told herself that was the situation. The circumstances. The shock of the coincidence wearing off. She did not examine it further, but she checked the path between the two properties on her way back, noted where the fence line ran, calculated how long the walk would take. 4 minutes. She walked home in 4 minutes, and she didn't let herself think about what that meant. But she thought about it anyway. She told herself the next morning that yesterday had been an exception, a strange once-in-a-lifetime collision of coincidence and circumstance that had required her to spend 7 hours at a neighbor's table going through documents, and that was done now, and things would return to normal, and she would be sensible about all of it. Then she stepped onto her porch with her coffee and found Jacob Callahan, already at the fence line between their properties, examining the post she'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, and all her sensible intentions rearranged themselves without asking her permission. "That post is rotted at the base," he said without looking up. "Another hard wind, and you'll lose 20 feet of fence line." "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to get to it. I have spare posts in the barn." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I don't need charity, Mr. Callahan." He did look up then. "I didn't offer charity. I offered fence posts." A pause. "There's a difference." She wanted to argue with that. She recognized somewhere in the back of her mind that she was looking for a reason to argue that arguing would establish distance, and distance was the sensible thing to maintain right now. But he was already turning back to the post, and she couldn't find a reason that didn't sound small, so she said nothing. He fixed the fence that morning. She brought him coffee at 10 o'clock because leaving a man to work on her property without offering coffee was the kind of thing her mother would have haunted her for, and that was the only reason. They stood on opposite sides of the fence line and drank in silence for a few minutes, and it was the most comfortable silence she'd experienced in 2 years. That made her more uneasy than the arguing would have. "I've been thinking about the water rights documents," she said, because the water rights documents were safe ground. "Thomas kept a strongbox in the barn. I haven't opened it since he died. I told myself it was because I didn't need what was in it, but the truth is I couldn't." She stopped. "I think it's time." Jacob nodded. No pity in it, just acknowledgement. "Do you want help?" "No," she said immediately. Then 3 seconds later, "Maybe." He didn't smile, but something around his eyes shifted in a way that she was beginning to recognize. "Tell me when." She told him that afternoon. The strongbox was exactly where she remembered, behind the loose board on the south wall of the barn, which Thomas had thought was a secret, and which Hannah had known about since their 3rd month of marriage. She'd never told him she knew. Some secrets were kindnesses. She pulled it out and set it on the workbench, and her hands were steadier than she'd expected them to be. Jacob stood 2 steps back without being asked to, which she noticed and appreciated without saying so. The key was on the ring she kept in her kitchen drawer. She opened the box. Inside, a deed which she expected. A folded letter from Thomas's lawyer, which she expected. Several receipts. A small photograph she hadn't known existed, Thomas with a man she didn't recognize. Both of them squinting into bright sun somewhere that wasn't Cedar Creek. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilskin, a journal. Small, battered, the pages swollen like it had been through wet weather more than once. She picked it up carefully. "I didn't know he kept one," she said. Jacob said nothing. He was looking at the photograph. Something in his posture had changed. "What?" she said. He reached out slowly and picked up the photograph. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, Blackwood Land East Survey Line, May, 1887. The air went out of the barn. Hannah looked at the man beside Thomas in the photograph. Then she looked at Jacob. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's the surveyor," Jacob said. His voice was very level. "The one who got drunk and talked. That's Mitchell Greer." He set the photograph down carefully. "He disappeared in December. I thought he'd moved on. I didn't know he'd been here." "He was here in May of 1887, Hannah said. 4 months before Thomas died." The words sat between them like something fallen that couldn't be picked back up. Thomas had known. He had known about the fraudulent surveys, or at least suspected. He'd found the surveyor. He'd had his photograph taken with him, and he'd hidden it at the bottom of a strongbox, like a man who understood exactly what kind of trouble he was holding. And then in September of 1887, Thomas Whitmore had ridden out on the West Ridge Trail, and his horse had come back without him. "Read the journal," Jacob said quietly. Her hands were not as steady now. She opened it. Thomas's handwriting was cramped and fast, the handwriting of a man who thought faster than his pen could follow. She'd always teased him about it, told him his letters looked like a fence in a windstorm. She hadn't seen his handwriting in over 2 years, and for a moment the sight of it stopped her completely. Jacob waited. He was good at waiting. She was beginning to understand that about him, that stillness wasn't indifference, it was just his way of making room. She read. The first entries were from March of 1887. Thomas had noticed discrepancies in the county land records when he'd gone to file a routine water access renewal. Numbers that didn't match. A signature on a transfer document that looked wrong. He'd mentioned it to the county recorder, who'd told him the records were fine and not to worry himself. He'd come home and worried himself considerably. By April, he'd found 2 other ranchers with similar irregularities. By May, he'd found Mitchell Greer. "Greer says Blackwood has been running this scheme for 6 years, Thomas had written. He changed survey lines. He forged signatures on transfer documents. He waited for men to die or go broke, and then filed claims against their widows and heirs before anyone knew what was happening. Greer says he has copies of the original surveys, the real ones hidden somewhere safe. Says he's too scared to go to a judge alone, needs someone to go with him. I told him I'd go. Hannah's throat closed. She kept reading. The last entry in the journal was dated September 3rd, 1887. 5 days before Thomas died. Meeting Greer next week on the ridge. He's bringing the documents. We'll take everything to Judge Harmon and Helena together. I haven't told Hannah. I don't want her to worry until this is finished. When it's done, I'll tell her everything. She closed the journal. Her hands were shaking now, and she didn't try to stop them. Jacob was very still across the workbench. He was protecting me, she said. Yes. He didn't tell me because he was trying to protect me. Yes. And Greer disappeared, and Thomas... She couldn't finish it. We don't know yet, Jacob said. We don't have proof of what happened on that ridge. We know what Thomas suspected. We know Greer was there. We know the timing. Someone knew they were meeting. That's what I believe, yes. She set the journal down. She pressed both palms flat on the workbench and breathed slow, deliberate, the way she breathed when she was out in the orchard at 2 a.m, and the grief had gotten bigger than the house could hold. Blackwood knows, she said. He knows Thomas had evidence. That's why he's coming after the water rights now. He's not just greedy, he's covering his tracks. That's what I've been trying to confirm, Jacob said. The water rights claim is the least of it. He wants access to this property. He wants to know what Thomas left behind. He wants the journal. And the photograph. And anything else that connects him to Greer. Hannah stood up straight. She looked at Jacob across the workbench, and something had shifted in her, not grief, not fear, though both were still present. Something older and harder than either of those things. Something that felt like Thomas, actually. Like the part of him that had ridden out to meet a scared surveyor on a ridge, when the sensible thing was to stay home and let it alone. Then we're not giving it to him, she said. No, Jacob agreed. We're not. We need copies of everything. Already thinking the same thing. And we need to find out what happened to Mitchell Greer. Jacob looked at her for a moment. Hannah. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected. Not intimate exactly, but direct. Real. Like he was looking at her, and not at the widow, not at the woman in a difficult situation, but at her. This is going to get complicated. Blackwood has money and lawyers and people in this county who owe him favors. If we start pulling on this thread... Thomas already pulled on it, she said. He pulled on it alone, and I didn't know, and I couldn't... Her voice broke just once, then steadied. I'm not letting that happen again. Whatever thread is left to pull, I'm pulling it, with or without help. Jacob nodded. With, he said simply. What followed were 2 weeks that Hannah would later describe to herself only as the strangest and most clarifying of her life. They worked every day. Not together in the way that set tongues wagging. She wasn't naive about Cedar Creek's appetite for gossip, but methodically carefully with the kind of focus that left no room for anything complicated. She would bring what she found in Thomas's papers. He would bring what he'd gathered from the surveyor's talk and his own investigation over the fall. They would sit at her kitchen table, or his, depending on who'd made dinner, and they would compare, cross-reference, argue about interpretation. They argued more than she expected. Not badly. Not the way she'd argued with Thomas sometimes, which had been all heat and no light, but the way two people who are both stubborn and both smart argue circling the same problem from different angles until one of them found the opening. She liked it. She liked it more than she was prepared to admit. You're wrong about the Helena filing date, she said one evening, not looking up from the ledger page she was examining. I've been over it 3 times, he said. Then you've been wrong 3 times. Look at the notary stamp. That date is June 15th, not June 5th. Someone altered the number. A pause. Then the sound of him pulling the page toward himself. I'll be damned, he said quietly. Yes, you will be, if you keep insisting you've already checked things thoroughly. He looked up from the page. She was still studying the ledger, and she felt him looking, and she made herself keep her eyes on the page for a moment longer than necessary before she glanced up. His expression had that complicated thing in it again, the thing she didn't have a word for yet, which she was increasingly aware she was going to need a word for. "You're very good at this," he said. "Thomas used to say I should have been a lawyer." She looked back down at the ledger. He meant it as a compliment. "My father thought it was an insult. I always thought it was just accurate." "It is accurate." Jacob set down the page. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said, which was more than she'd planned to say. The silence that followed was that kind of silence again, the comfortable, dangerous kind that she had no framework for, because she hadn't felt it with anyone since Thomas. She broke it by announcing she needed more coffee, and she got up and made it, and when she came back, they went back to the ledgers, and that was that. Except it wasn't entirely because the word she didn't have kept sitting in the back of her mind all evening, stubborn as a rotted fence post refusing to leave.
Mampasabar.
Cedar Creek noticed. Of course it did. Cedar Creek was a town of approximately 400 people in a territory where the main entertainment was watching what your neighbors were doing. And the widow Whitmore had been a person of great communal interest for 2 years. The moment Jacob Callahan arrived next door, and Hannah was seen walking back from his property at 5 in the afternoon with her coat on wrong. The town began forming opinions. Margaret Hollis mentioned it in the dry goods store. Reverend Dawes mentioned it from the pulpit, not by name, but with sufficient specificity that everyone knew. 3 ranch wives came to call on Hannah within a single week, one after another, each bearing food, and each staying long enough to determine whether Jacob Callahan was a respectable prospect or a potential scandal. Hannah received them politely. She thanked them for the food. She answered their questions about Jacob with information so carefully bland it conveyed nothing. What she did not tell them, that she already knew more about Jacob Callahan than she knew about most people she'd spent years in company with. That he'd been writing to her for 10 months. That he made his coffee too strong and apologized for it every single time, which was something she found inexplicably endearing. That 2 nights ago he'd told her over those ledgers that the years on the cattle drives had felt like paying penance for something he couldn't name for surviving when his wife hadn't, for wanting to live again when it felt like wanting shouldn't be allowed anymore. She had not written down what she'd said back to him. She didn't need to. It was the same thing she'd told JC in a letter the previous February, almost word for word, that grief didn't have an expiration date, but it also wasn't meant to be a permanent address. That surviving was the start of something, not the end of it. He had gone very still when she said it. "You wrote that to me," he said. "In February." "I know. I read it probably 20 times. She picked up her coffee. "It was a very long winter." He laughed. A short, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before a person thinks to keep it in, and it was the finest sound she'd heard in a while. She felt it somewhere in her chest and made herself look at the ledger page instead of at him. Then the knock at the door came. Victor Blackwood did not look like what Hannah had expected. She'd built him into something in her mind, hard-faced, obviously menacing, the kind of man you could identify as dangerous from 50 yards. The man on her porch was soft around the middle, well-dressed with an open and friendly expression that she might have found reassuring if she hadn't spent the last 2 weeks reading her dead husband's evidence against him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Behind her she heard Jacob stand up from the kitchen table. Blackwood's pleasant expression flickered just once, just briefly, when he registered Jacob in the doorway. Then it was back, smooth as new paint. "Mr. Callahan," he said. "I didn't realize you were acquainted." "We're neighbors," Hannah said. "Can I help you, Mr. Blackwood? Just a neighborly call." He smiled at her. It was an excellent smile. She distrusted it completely. "I wanted to discuss the water rights matter directly with you. I feel there may have been some misunderstanding from my lawyers, and I'd like to resolve this amicably if possible." "I don't believe there's any misunderstanding," Hannah said. "The water rights on this property belong to this property." "The documents suggest otherwise." "The documents are wrong." The smile stayed, but something behind it cooled by several degrees. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this has been a difficult time. You've managed admirably on your own. But the legal situation is clear, and I'd hate to see you spend money on a case you can't win when we could settle this simply and fairly. What would that look like? Jacob said from behind her. His voice was perfectly level. She recognized the tone she'd heard it in the letters when he was being most careful. Blackwood glanced at him. This is really a matter between Mrs. Whitmore and my office. Mrs. Whitmore has asked me to be present for any discussions about the property, Jacob said. This was the first Hannah had heard of this, but she kept her face still and said nothing. So whatever you have to say, you can say it with both of us here. Blackwood studied Jacob for a moment. Whatever he found there, he decided to redirect. I'm prepared to offer you a fair settlement price for the water access rights, he said to Hannah. More than fair. Enough that you could improve the rest of the property substantially. No, Hannah said. You haven't heard the number. It doesn't matter, she said. This property, all of it including the water rights, belonged to my husband and it belongs to me now. I'm not interested in settling something that isn't in dispute. The warmth left Blackwood's face entirely. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, quiet now, almost gentle, which was worse than threatening. Your husband was a good man from what I've heard. I'd hate for his affairs to become complicated posthumously. Sometimes when men get involved in things they don't fully understand, they leave behind loose ends that are better left untouched. The silence that followed was different from any silence Hannah had sat in that day. She heard her own heartbeat. She heard Jacob's stillness behind her. That particular stillness, the one that wasn't peace, but the thing that came before a decision. Thank you for the visit, Mr. Blackwood, she said. I'll have my lawyer respond to your office directly. A beat. Good day then, Blackwood said. She closed the door. She stood with her hand on the latch for 3 full seconds without moving. He knows, she said. He knows Thomas found something. He didn't come here to negotiate, Jacob said. He came to see what you knew, and to warn you. A pause. And to see who was in your kitchen. She turned around. Jacob's face was careful closed in the way it got when he was thinking hard. He'll move faster now, he said. Then so will we, she said. She walked back to the table, sat down, picked up the ledger page she'd set down when the knock came. Her hands were steady. Jacob looked at her for a moment with that expression she still didn't have a word for, and then he sat down across from her and picked up his own page, and they went back to work. Outside, she heard the sound of Blackwood's horse leaving the yard. She listened until it faded. Then she thought about the journal in Thomas's strongbox, and the photograph of the missing surveyor, and the notary stamp that someone had altered by 10 days, and she turned the ledger page and kept going. Because Thomas had started this, and she was going to finish it, whatever it cost, whatever it took, and she was not going to do it alone. 3 days after Victor Blackwood knocked on Hannah's door, someone broke into her barn. She knew the moment she opened it that morning. Not because anything obvious was missing. Her tools were where she'd left them, the horses untouched, the hay undisturbed. She knew because the strongbox was back behind the loose board exactly as she'd left it, but at a slightly different angle. Off by 2 inches. The kind of thing only a person who had placed it there herself would notice. She stood very still in the middle of the barn for a moment. Then she walked to the house, took Thomas's journal and the photograph and the altered ledger copies Jacob had made, and she hid them in a place that had nothing to do with the barn or the strongbox. She hid them inside the lining of Thomas's winter coat, which hung at the back of the bedroom closet behind 3 other coats, because no man sent to search a barn or a kitchen would think to look inside a dead man's winter coat in July. Then she walked across the field to Jacob's door and knocked. He answered in a state that suggested she'd woken him, which meant it was earlier than she'd realized. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" "Someone was in my barn last night. They were looking for the strongbox." He stepped back from the door. She came in. "Did they get anything?" "No. We moved everything 2 days ago." She sat down at his kitchen table. She'd grown accustomed to his kitchen in a way that she'd stopped noticing until just now, sitting in it, after something frightening and feeling despite everything that she was somewhere safe. But they know we have documents, Jacob. This isn't just a legal dispute anymore. It was never just a legal dispute. He put the coffee pot on. I should have moved you sooner. I'm not moving. This is my property. I didn't mean permanently. I know what you meant, and the answer is no. She looked at him steadily. I'm not leaving my land because Victor Blackwood sent someone to frighten me. That is exactly what he wants. Jacob turned around. He had that look on him, the one she'd started to catalog in her head without intending, to the look where he was deciding between saying the thing that would protect her feelings and the thing that was true. You're not frightened, he said. I'm terrified, she said immediately. I'm so frightened I could barely walk across the field without shaking. That doesn't mean I'm leaving. Something in his expression settled. All right, he said. Then we move faster. We take what we have to Judge Harmon and Helena before Blackwood's people can do anything else. It's not enough yet. You said so yourself 2 weeks ago. You said we needed the original survey documents, the ones Greer was supposed to bring Thomas on the ridge. I know what I said. So, where are they? He poured the coffee, set a cup in front of her, sat down, and then he said quietly, I think I know where Greer hid them. She stared at him. How long have you known this? I've suspected it for 3 days. I didn't say anything because I needed to confirm it first, and because if I'm right about where they are getting to them is going to require... He paused, choosing the word carefully. Delicacy. Where are they? He met her eyes. The Cedar Creek Land Registry Office. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. They're in Blackwood's own records, she said slowly. Hidden in plain sight. Greer was a surveyor. He had legitimate access to the registry office. He filed documents there regularly. My guess is he slipped his copies of the original surveys into a routine filing under a different parcel number somewhere in the stacks that Blackwood's people wouldn't think to look, because it wouldn't occur to them that a man scared for his life would hide evidence in the one place they controlled. That's either brilliant or insane. Greer was scared and running out of time. Probably both. He wrapped both hands around his cup. The registry clerk, young man named Arthur Pell, I've had 2 conversations with him. He's not loyal to Blackwood, but he's afraid of him. If I ask him directly for access to the files, word gets back. But if I ask him, Hannah said, it's a widow following up on her husband's land records. That's routine. That's nothing. Jacob looked at her. You're going to tell me that's dangerous, she said. I was going to say you're already thinking 3 steps ahead, and I'm still on step 2. A pause. It is also dangerous. Can you be somewhere nearby? I can be right outside the door. Then we go tomorrow morning. Arthur Pell was 23 years old and had the specific nervous energy of a person who understood that his job put him in the middle of something much larger than his pay grade. Hannah recognized it the moment she walked into the registry office, the way his eyes went to the door behind her, checking who was with her, and the way his shoulders dropped a fraction when he saw she was alone. She had of course told Jacob to wait outside. Jacob had objected. She'd explained with precision that a widow coming to review her late husband's land records was routine, and a widow arriving with a large and somewhat visibly watchful cattle rancher was not routine. He had accepted this and remained outside, and she'd walked in alone, which she'd done many times in the past 2 years, and which she was perfectly capable of doing again. Mrs. Whitmore, Arthur said. What can I do for you? I'd like to review the parcel records related to my property, she said pleasantly. And the surrounding parcels if you don't mind. I'm trying to get a complete picture of the water rights situation for my lawyer. Of course. He moved to the filing stacks. Which survey years? 1884 through 87 if you have them. He pulled the files. He set them on the counter. And then he did something she didn't expect. He looked at the door, looked back at her, and said in a voice stripped of all professional courtesy, Mrs. Whitmore, are you working with Jacob Callahan on this? She kept her face smooth. Mr. Callahan has been kind enough to help me understand some of the legal complexities. Arthur leaned slightly across the counter. "I knew your husband," he said. "Not well. But he came in here in the spring of '87 asking about the same records. He was polite. He was careful. He thanked me and left." A pause. 2 months later, Mr. Blackwood's man came in and asked me what Mr. Whitmore had been looking at. Hannah's hands were on the counter. She didn't move them. "What did you tell him?" she said. "The truth. That he'd reviewed the standard parcel files." Arthur's jaw was tight. "I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know what Blackwood was doing." He looked at the files on the counter between them. "There's a misfiled document in the 1886 stack. Parcel number that doesn't correspond to any property in this county. I noticed it 8 months ago. I left it where it was because I didn't know who to trust." Hannah looked at the stack. "Show me," she said. "Door." The document was tucked between 2 routine survey filings, exactly as Jacob had guessed invisible, unless you were looking for a parcel number that didn't belong. Hannah recognized Mitchell Greer's surveyor's seal on the first page. Her hands were very steady as she turned the pages. They were the original surveys. All of them. 6 years' worth of Blackwood's fraudulent land manipulations, laid out in Greer's meticulous handwriting, each one cross-referenced with the altered version filed in its place. There were 17 properties. 12 widows or heirs who'd lost land they didn't know had been stolen from them. 3 ranchers who'd sold under pressure, not understanding the papers they were signing, were based on false survey lines. And there at the back, a statement in Greer's hand dated September 1st, 1887. 2 days before Thomas's final journal entry, I, Mitchell Greer, attest that the following survey records have been deliberately falsified at the direction of Victor Blackwood, beginning in the year 1881. I participated in this falsification under duress and am prepared to testify before a judge of competent jurisdiction. I am placing this documentation in the Cedar Creek Land Registry as a safeguard. I intend to bring copies to Thomas Whitmore of Cedar Creek on the date of September 8, 1887, so that we may present this evidence together. September 8, 1887, the day Thomas died. Hannah put the paper down. She pressed her hand flat over it on the counter. Arthur Pell was watching her from a careful distance. He understood she thought that something large was happening, and that the right thing to do was be quiet and let it happen. "I need to take these," she said. Her voice was even. She was very proud of her voice in that moment. "I know," Arthur said. "I had a feeling when you walked in. I've had a feeling for 8 months. He pulled a clean envelope from his drawer. "Take what you need. I'll note in the records that the misfiled document was removed for correction. That buys you time before anyone notices." "Arthur," she looked at him. "You understand what this means. If Blackwood finds out you helped—" "I knew Thomas Whitmore," he said simply. "I didn't do enough when he was alive. I'd like to do something now." She took the documents. She walked out the door. Jacob was 6 feet away, and he took one look at her face, at the envelope in her hands, at the specific controlled expression she was wearing, and he didn't ask a single question. He just fell into step beside her, and they walked down the main street of Cedar Creek together, and she didn't say a word until they were well past the last building out on the open road. Then she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd known about him from the letters, and which was just as extraordinary in person. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "September 8th, he said. "Yes." "He rode out to meet Greer, and someone made sure he didn't come back." "Yes." "And Greer?" "Greer disappeared in December, 3 months later. Long enough that the timing wouldn't be obvious." She gripped the envelope. "He killed Thomas Jacob, or had him killed, to stop this. We don't have proof of that part yet. No, but we have proof of everything else. 17 properties, 12 widows, forged surveys, Greer's sworn statement naming him directly." She stopped walking. She turned to face him on the road, and the summer sun was full on her face, and she didn't care. "This is enough for a judge." He looked at her. The expression she didn't have a word for had resolved into something clearer than she'd seen it, yet something that was about her specifically, not about the case or the evidence or the situation. Something that she recognized with a lurch behind her sternum, because she'd felt it herself and had been carefully not looking at it for 3 weeks. "Hannah," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything. You were about to say something cautious, something about not getting ahead of ourselves or being careful about assumptions." She looked at him steadily. "I'm aware of all those things. I'm also standing here on a road outside my own town, holding the documents that prove my husband was murdered, and I need 30 seconds to be angry about that before I go back to being careful." He waited. She breathed. She let herself be angry fully cleanly, without managing it down into something more acceptable. She let it move through her like weather moving through a valley, and then she let it pass. And then she was herself again, composed, clear. "All right," she said. "We need to move. If Blackwood's people check the registry office today—" "They won't. His man only goes in on Fridays. This is Tuesday." He paused. "I checked." She stared at him. "When did you check?" "Last week, when I first thought the documents might be there." "You went to the registry office last week?" "Yes." "And you talked to Arthur Pell?" "A beat. Briefly." "Jacob Callahan." She said his name in a tone she usually reserved for cattle that had gotten into the orchard. "You told me 3 days ago that you suspected the documents might be there. I said I'd suspected it for 3 days. You did not say you'd already been to the office." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." "Why not?" He looked at her directly. "Because I'd already asked Arthur about the filing system, and I knew getting the documents out required someone with a legitimate reason to be there reviewing their own property records. I needed you to go in fresh, without me having already been there, and potentially putting Arthur on guard." He paused. "I knew you could handle it. I knew you'd be better at it than I would. And I knew if I told you my plan, you'd argue with it for an hour before agreeing, and we didn't have the time." The silence stretched. "That," she said, "is either the most manipulative thing anyone has said to me or a genuine compliment, and I haven't decided which." "It was both," he said honestly. Another silence. Shorter this time. "You're going to have to stop doing that," she said. "Complimenting you. Making decisions without telling me. I don't care how right you turn out to be. This is my land, my husband, my—" She stopped, steadied. "We do this together. All of it. Agreed." "Agreed," he said. No hesitation. She believed him. That was the part that surprised her, how completely and immediately she believed him. After 2 years of navigating a world that had required her to trust no one fully, to verify everything, to stand on her own ground, without assuming anyone else's ground was solid, she believed him, without reservation. She wasn't sure what to do with that yet. "We need to get to Helena," she said. "Judge Harmon, before Friday. I can have horses ready by tomorrow dawn." "Then we leave tomorrow dawn." She tucked the envelope more firmly under her arm. "And Jacob." He looked at her. "When this is over," she said carefully, "we're going to have a different conversation. About the letters, about other things, but not now. Now we focus on this." He held her gaze for a moment. The thing she'd been avoiding naming was right there between them, plainly visible to both of them, and neither of them moved toward it or away from it. They just let it exist, acknowledged and patient, like something that could afford to wait, because it already knew how it was going to end. "Understood," he said. They turned back toward Cedar Creek. She matched his stride without thinking about it, which she only noticed because it had become effortless. The way long familiarity made things effortless. The way 10 months of letters had already worn a groove between them that her feet apparently knew even when her head was elsewhere. They were almost back to town when Jacob said without breaking stride, "For the record, it was a compliment." She didn't look at him. "I know. I just wanted to be clear." "Jacob." "Yes. Stop talking." He stopped talking, but she heard what she'd come to recognize as his almost laugh, and it did the same thing to her chest that it always did, and she kept walking and didn't look at him, and thought about 17 stolen properties and 12 widows who didn't know yet that someone was coming to give them their land back. She thought about Thomas, who had ridden out on a September morning to do the right thing and hadn't come home. She thought about Mitchell Greer's testimony sitting in her hands, finally free from the filing stack where he'd hidden it months before he disappeared. She thought we almost didn't find it. We would never have found it if not for the letters. If not for me writing to a stranger about frost and orchards and making yourself feel less alone. If not for him writing back about cattle drives and grief and second chances. The letters had brought them to each other, and in doing so, they had led both of them, without either of them knowing, directly to the truth. She gripped the envelope. She walked into Cedar Creek with her head up and Jacob Callahan at her side. And somewhere in Helena, Judge Harmon was about to have a very significant week. The ride to Helena took 2 days. They left before dawn on Wednesday, which meant Cedar Creek was still asleep when they passed through, and Hannah was grateful for that. She wasn't ready for the questions. She wasn't ready for Margaret Hollis's raised eyebrows, or Reverend Dawes's pointed silence, or the particular way the town would look at her, at both of them riding out together in the gray early morning, like people with somewhere urgent to be. They had somewhere urgent to be. She rode with the envelope inside her coat against her chest, which was impractical and possibly slightly irrational, but she'd put it there without thinking, and then decided not to second-guess herself about it. Those papers had waited 8 months in a filing stack for someone to find them. They could survive against her coat lining for 2 days. Jacob rode without much conversation for the first few hours, which she appreciated. She was doing a great deal of thinking that required quiet, and he seemed to understand that without being told. This was something she'd noticed about him consistently, the way he read what a person needed without requiring them to say it out loud. In the letters, she'd assumed it was a function of the medium that he had time to think before responding. In person, she was beginning to understand it was just how he was built. It was around midday when they stopped to rest the horses and eat what she'd packed that he said the thing she hadn't known she needed to hear. Thomas would have liked this, he said, not cautiously, not carefully, just plainly the way he said things that were true. Someone finishing what he started. She looked at him. You didn't know him, she said. No, but I know what he did. A man who finds evidence of a conspiracy against his own neighbors and walks straight toward it instead of away from it, that's a particular kind of person. He paused. The kind worth finishing something for. She looked away. Toward the mountains, toward the distance, because her throat had closed, and she was not going to cry on a road in Montana Territory 2 days before the most important legal confrontation of her life. He would have liked you, she said finally. That's the strange part. He would have thought you were all right. High praise. From Thomas it was. She stood up, brushed off her skirt. We should keep moving. They kept moving. Judge Erasmus Harmon had the office of a man who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had stopped trying to make it look comfortable. He was 61 years old, lean with the kind of permanent skepticism in his eyes that came from spending decades listening to people explain why their situation was an exception to the rules. He looked at Hannah and Jacob across his desk and said, "Start from the beginning." They did. Jacob spoke first. The surveyor, the cattle drive Mitchell Greer's drunken confession at the campfire. Then Hannah took the documents from her coat and set them on the desk one by one. The photograph, the altered ledger pages, Thomas's journal, and finally Greer's sworn statement with his surveyor's seal and the original surveys behind it, 17 properties documented in meticulous detail. Harmon did not speak during any of this. He read. He turned pages with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who was not going to be hurried, and Hannah sat in her chair and held herself very still, because the urge to ask him what he was thinking was almost physical, and she was not going to give in to it. Jacob was still beside her. She was aware of him the way she'd become aware of things that were steady like a fence line in bad weather, like the ridge on the east horizon that told her which way the wind was going to turn. Harmon finished reading. He set the last page down. He looked at Hannah. "Your husband gathered this evidence," he said. "He started it. Mr. Callahan confirmed it and found the gaps. I found the registry documents." And the sworn statement is from Mitchell Greer. Yes? Who is currently missing, Jacob said. Since December of last year. Harmon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And you believe Blackwood? I believe Thomas Whitmore rode out on September 8th of last year to meet Greer with the intention of bringing you exactly what I've just brought you, Hannah said. And that he died on that ride. And that Greer disappeared 3 months later. And that the pattern of those events combined with this evidence tells a story I think you're capable of reading, Your Honor. Harmon was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, what you're suggesting goes beyond land fraud. I'm aware of what I'm suggesting. If I issue a summons based on this, if I call a public hearing, Blackwood will have lawyers in this room before the ink is dry. He has resources, and he has connections, and he has spent 6 years making himself appear legitimate. He also has 17 stolen properties and a dead witness and a missing surveyor, Hannah said. And now I have the original surveys, with Greer's statement attached, which a judge of competent jurisdiction. She stopped, took a breath, kept her voice level. Which means this is your jurisdiction, Your Honor, and I'm asking you to use it. Harmon looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Jacob. You'll testify to the surveyor's original statement. Everything I told Mrs. Whitmore I'll say in open court, Jacob said, under oath. And the registry clerk Pell. He knew the document was misfiled. He left it where it was because he didn't know who to trust. He'll talk. He'll need to be protected. We're aware of that. Harmon picked up Greer's sworn statement again. He read the last paragraph a second time. Hannah watched his face and saw the moment when the weight of it fully landed, not as legal documentation, but as what it actually was, which was a man writing down the truth in a place he hoped someone would find it, knowing he was running out of time. I'll issue the summons, Harmon said. Public hearing, Cedar Creek Courthouse, 2 weeks from Friday. I want every rancher and property owner named in these documents notified directly, and I want Blackwood served by my own marshal, not the county office. Why not the county office? Hannah asked. Because the county recorder's office in 2 of these districts reported irregularities to Blackwood's lawyers before reporting them to the state. I don't know how deep this goes yet. He set the paper down. I'm going to find out. Hannah exhaled, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a single long breath that released something she'd been holding since she'd opened Thomas's strongbox and found his journal. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Harmon said. Thank me when the verdict's in. Cedar Creek found out about the hearing, the way Cedar Creek found out about most things in pieces from multiple directions, none of them entirely accurate. All of them more dramatic than the reality. By the time Hannah and Jacob returned from Helena, the story had already shapeshifted twice, first into a rumor that the widow Whitmore was suing Victor Blackwood for personal damages, and then into an even more distorted version involving disputed cattle and a fistfight that Jacob found so baffling he couldn't identify which real event it had been constructed from. Margaret Hollis intercepted Hannah at the post office the morning after they returned. Is it true, she demanded with no preamble whatsoever, which Hannah had always privately respected about Margaret, even when she found her exhausting. You've gone to a judge about the Blackwood water rights business. It's more than the water rights, Hannah said. Margaret's eyes sharpened. How much more? 17 properties, 12 widows across 3 counties. Hannah held Margaret's gaze, including Ruth Alderman's place, which she lost 4 years ago, and never understood why. The color left Margaret Hollis's face. Ruth Alderman was Margaret's cousin. Hannah had found Ruth's property in Greer's documentation 2 days ago in Helena and had said nothing until now, waiting for the moment to say it to the right person. She watched Margaret Hollis town gossip. Opinion shaper the woman who had asked. Hannah pointed questions about remarrying at the dry goods counter for 2 years, absorbed the implications of what she'd just been told. Ruth thought she'd signed the papers wrong, Margaret said slowly. She blamed herself. She moved in with her daughter because she thought she'd made a mistake. She didn't make a mistake, Hannah said. Someone made a mistake for her, without her knowledge. and that someone is going to stand in front of a judge in Cedar Creek and answer for it. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she squared her shoulders in the way of a woman who has just identified what needs to be done and intends to do it comprehensively. "Who needs to know about the hearing?" she said. "Everyone," Hannah said. Cedar Creek's communication network, when activated by the right person, was faster and more effective than any telegraph system Hannah had encountered. Within 48 hours, every rancher, farmer, and property owner in the surrounding territory who had ever had dealings with Blackwood's syndicate had heard about the hearing. 3 women Hannah had never met came to her door on separate days. Quiet, careful women with the specific dignity of people who had survived hard things without help, and each of them had a story that matched the pattern in Greer's documents with the precision of something that had been waiting years for a shape to fit into. Each of them said a version of the same thing they had wondered. They had never stopped wondering. They had been told they were wrong or confused or too grief-stricken to understand what they'd signed. Each of them agreed to testify. Hannah sent their names to Judge Harmon by post the following morning. Victor Blackwood's response came 4 days before the hearing, not from Blackwood himself. From his lawyer, a man named Prescott, who wore his suit like a weapon and delivered a sealed letter to Hannah's door at 7 in the morning, which was a time chosen, she understood specifically to suggest urgency and unsettle her. She read the letter at her kitchen table with Jacob across from her and her coffee going cold. Prescott's letter was 3 pages of elegant legal language that boiled down to a single threat: withdraw from the hearing, accept a financial settlement, and sign a document releasing Blackwood from any further claims. In exchange, he would drop the water rights case against her property permanently. And then the last paragraph, which was not legal language at all, which was personal. My client wishes Mrs. Whitmore to understand that the individuals who have agreed to testify on her behalf may find themselves subject to a review of their own property records, which in several cases contain irregularities that would benefit from legal clarification. My client is prepared to be generous toward those who cooperate and thorough toward those who do not. Hannah set the letter down. He's threatening the witnesses, she said. Yes, Jacob said. He'd read it over her shoulder. He's threatening women who already lost everything once. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment with her back to him, because what she was feeling was large and needed a moment to settle into something she could use rather than something that would just burn. He's more scared than I thought, she said. He should be, Jacob said. He knows what those documents mean. What do we do about the witnesses? We tell them. He said it without hesitation. We tell them exactly what his letter says and we let them decide. We don't decide for them. They've had enough decisions made for them. She turned around. And if some of them step back, then they step back. And we go forward with what we have, which is Greer's statement, and the original surveys, and your husband's journal, and Arthur Pell and me. He met her eyes. It's enough, Hannah. It was enough in Harmon's office. It'll be enough in that courtroom. You're very certain. I'm certain enough, he said. Which I know is not the same thing, but it's what I've got. She breathed. All right, she said. We tell them. She told them herself in person, one at a time, traveling to each woman's home, because they deserved that. She brought the letter. She read them the relevant paragraph. She told them she understood completely if they needed to protect themselves, and that she would not think less of them, and that their original testimony had already helped build the case regardless. Every single one of them said they were coming to the hearing. One woman, a rancher named Clara Briggs, 62, who had lost her family's homestead 4 years earlier and moved into a single room above her son's barn, said something that Hannah turned over in her mind for days afterward. Honey, Clara said, I've been scared of Victor Blackwood for 4 years. Scared doesn't change what he did. And it won't change what that judge decides. The only thing that changes in this situation is whether I walk into that courtroom or not. And I have been sitting in my son's barn for 4 years. I am done sitting. The morning of the hearing, Cedar Creek filled up. Not just townspeople, ranchers came from 20 miles out. Families who'd heard through Margaret Hollis's network and through the quiet, effective communication of people who had been waiting for this. The courthouse was not large enough, and by the time the judge called order, people were standing in the doorway and the steps outside and leaning in through the open windows. Hannah sat at the front beside Jacob and Arthur Pell and a young lawyer named Davies that Harmon had recommended for her, a sharp, serious man who had spent an hour the previous day telling her the case was stronger than he'd expected, and then asking her twice if she was sure about proceeding, which told her he was thorough enough to be worth trusting. Victor Blackwood sat across the aisle with Prescott and two additional lawyers, and an expression of supreme confidence that Hannah recognized as the expression of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 20 years and did not know yet that this room was different. She looked at him directly. She held his gaze until he looked away first, then she looked forward. Harmon called order. The hearing began. Davies presented the case methodically. The altered survey lines, the forged transfer documents, the pattern across 3 counties, the dates and names and amounts and properties. He was not theatrical about it. He didn't need to be. The documents spoke clearly enough that theatrics would have been a distraction. Prescott objected steadily through the first hour, challenged the provenance of the documents, challenged Arthur Pell's credibility, suggested that Mitchell Greer's statement from a man who could not be cross-examined because he was missing should be inadmissible. Harmon overruled him on Greer's statement in a sentence that Hannah would remember verbatim. The statement was notarized, sealed and filed in a public record under the surveyor's own professional seal. The only reason to exclude it would be to protect the person it names. This court is not in that business. Prescott's expression did not change, but something around his eyes tightened. Then Davies called Jacob to testify. Jacob was a steady witness. He did not embellish. He answered every question directly without qualification, without looking at anything except the judge and the person asking. He described the cattle drive Camp Greer's confession, the pattern he'd recognized when Hannah's letters described Thomas's land records. He described finding the altered notary date on the ledger page. Prescott cross-examined him hard. "Mr. Callahan, isn't it true that you have a personal relationship with Mrs. Whitmore that might affect the objectivity of your testimony?" "I do have a personal relationship with Mrs. Whitmore," Jacob said. Hannah heard the room shift a breath, a rustle, the particular sound of a crowd deciding what to do with new information. "Would you characterize that relationship as—" "She's my neighbor," Jacob said. "And she's the most honest person I've met in the Montana Territory. Those two things are related." He paused. "If you're suggesting that knowing someone's character makes your perception of their evidence less reliable, I'd argue the opposite. I know she didn't forge anything because I've read enough of her handwriting to recognize it, and none of this is it. I know she's not manufacturing a conspiracy because the woman does not have the patience for fiction. Is that the relationship you're asking about?" A sound moved through the courtroom that might have been a laugh, suppressed immediately by the gravity of the situation but present. Prescott changed direction. It didn't help him. When Clara Briggs took the stand and described in a quiet and utterly steady voice the day she was told her family's homestead had been legally transferred out of her name based on a document her husband had supposedly signed, a document in handwriting. She told the court she had examined for weeks and was not her husband's. Harmon watched her speak with an expression that had moved past judicial neutrality into something Hannah recognized as human anger, the contained professional kind. Then the second widow. Then the third. Hannah watched Victor Blackwood through all of it. She watched him speak in low, urgent tones to Prescott. She watched Prescott's confident posture change degree by degree across 2 hours of testimony until the confidence was still there in the surface of him, but had gone hollow underneath the way a fence post goes hollow before it finally gives. The moment that finished, it was not dramatic. It was Arthur Pell on the stand describing in specific detail how the filing system of the Cedar Creek Land Registry Office worked, what a legitimate parcel number looked like versus one that didn't correspond to any real property, and how long the misfiled document had been sitting in the stack when Hannah retrieved it. Prescott asked him, "And in your professional opinion, could this document have been placed there without your knowledge?" "Yes," Arthur said. Absolutely. We process hundreds of filings. A skilled surveyor with legitimate office access could have slipped a document into the stack without my noticing. That's exactly what happened. And you don't find it suspicious that this document appeared so conveniently? I find it suspicious, Arthur said carefully, that someone went to considerable trouble to hide the truth in a public record rather than destroy it. I think they were hoping someone would look. I think they knew they might not survive long enough to say it in person. The room went very quiet. Prescott sat down. Harmon ruled before end of day. He ruled in Hannah's favor on every count. The water rights restored. The deed confirmed the water access claim by Blackwood's syndicate dismissed permanently. He ordered an investigation into the 17 documented properties. He referred the evidence regarding Thomas Whitmore's death and Mitchell Greer's disappearance to the Territorial Marshal's office for criminal investigation. And he issued a judgment requiring Blackwood's syndicate to return properties or pay assessed compensation values to 12 former owners across 3 counties with interest within 60 days. Blackwood stood up when Harmon finished speaking. "This isn't over," he said, and his voice was still even, still controlled, but there was something underneath it that Hannah had not heard from him before the sound of a man who has just felt the ground move. "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood," Harmon said in a tone that made it clear this was not a request. "In my courtroom it is." The room erupted, not violently, not in the way of mobs or riots, in the way of people who had been holding something for a long time, years in some cases, and were releasing it all at once. Hannah heard Clara Briggs say something that she'd never heard the older woman say, which was inappropriate for a courthouse, and which Hannah thought was entirely fair. She heard Margaret Hollis, who had come and sat in the back and said nothing, which was its own extraordinary event, exhale a breath that sounded like it had been held since December. She heard Jacob beside her say quietly, "Done." One word. Just that. She looked at him. His expression was the one she'd been learning the name for, the one that had been visible since the morning on the porch when the pie hit the ground, and it was cleaner now than it had been unguarded in a way that the weeks of urgency and danger had not allowed. And she understood all at once that he had been carrying this alongside her, not just because it was right, not just because of the letters, or the coincidence, or the neighbors by chance, but because of her specifically. Because somewhere in 10 months of letters, she had become someone he would walk toward rather than away from, and that had not changed when she became a face and a voice, and a woman with her hands shaking over a strongbox in a barn. She looked away first this time. Outside the courthouse in the summer air, the crowd spilled onto the steps and into the street. Clara Briggs took Hannah's hands in both of hers and didn't say anything, which said everything. Ruth Alderman, who had come down from her daughter's house and sat in the back where Hannah had only noticed her halfway through the hearing, caught her eye across the crowd and nodded once, a nod that Hannah understood perfectly. Arthur Pell shook Jacob's hand and then, apparently surprising himself, shook Hannah's too. Davies, the lawyer, told her she should have been a lawyer. "That's the second time I've heard that," she said. "It'll keep being true," he said. She watched Victor Blackwood leave the courthouse with Prescott surrounded by his remaining lawyers, his confident posture intact, but his eyes doing something different from what they'd done when he arrived. He did not look at her as he passed. She watched him go and felt not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more lasting, the particular satisfaction of something set right that had been wrong for a long time. Thomas, she thought. We got there. Not alone. But we got there. She felt Jacob come to stand beside her as the crowd slowly began to disperse, and she didn't look at him because she didn't need to. She knew exactly where he was. She'd known, she thought, since approximately the 3rd letter since a cold November morning, when she'd gone to the post office and found his reply, and stood in the street reading it before she even made it home in the kind of cold that should have made her hurry and hadn't. "Ready to go home," he said. She thought about the word home, about what it contained, about the farm and the orchard and the apple trees she'd learned to protect from frost because tending living things made her feel less alone. About a 4-minute walk between 2 properties and a coffee cup she'd started leaving on the corner of a neighboring porch, because it was easier than carrying it back and forth. "Yes," she said. They walked back toward the horses together through a cedar creek that felt for the first time in 2 years and 3 months, and however many days she'd stopped counting, like somewhere that had turned a corner and found the light on the other side. The weeks after the hearing had a different texture to them. Not easier exactly. There was still work. Still the daily hard labor of running a homestead alone. Still the pile of legal correspondence that Davies sent from Helena every few days regarding the territorial marshal's investigation into Thomas's death and Greer's disappearance. There was still the low, persistent vigilance that 2 months of real danger had built into her, the habit of checking the barn in the morning, not just for the animals, but for evidence of intrusion. Habits built by fear took longer to leave than the fear itself. But the weight had shifted, something that had been pressing down on Hannah Whitmore from the inside, the unfinished quality of Thomas's death. The story that had no ending, the question she'd been carrying without anywhere to put it, had resolved into something she could set down. Not forget, never forget, but set down and walk away from when she needed to, which was a thing she hadn't been able to do before. Cedar Creek had changed too, in the subtle way that small towns change after large events, not dramatically, but in the accumulated small adjustments of people who have updated their understanding of things. Margaret Hollis stopped asking pointed questions about remarrying and started asking Hannah's opinion on the county water board elections, which was a different category of interest entirely, and one Hannah found considerably more tolerable. Reverend Dawes delivered a sermon about justice that was for once not aimed at her personally. Arthur Pell, who had been nervous for so long that nervous had become his default expression, started looking like a man who had done something he was quietly proud of. Clara Briggs got her property back. That was the one that made Hannah stand in her kitchen for 5 full minutes without moving, holding Davies's letter, reading the relevant sentence 3 times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. 60 days, Harmon had said. Blackwood's lawyers had contested every step of it, of course they had, but the territorial court had not been interested in Prescott's objections, and on a Tuesday in late October, Clara Briggs walked back onto her family's homestead for the first time in 4 years. She sent Hannah a single note. 4 words. The fields need work. Hannah read it and laughed out loud alone in her kitchen, and felt Thomas in the room with her, the way she sometimes did not. As grief, not anymore, but as something warmer and more bearable, like the memory of warmth, like the shape a person leaves in a place they loved. Ruth Alderman got her compensation settlement. 2 other women got properties back outright. The remaining cases were still working through the territorial court system, slow and procedural as a river in low water, but moving. Victor Blackwood, in the end, did not go quietly. He had lawyers and money, and he used both with considerable skill. But Harmon's referral to the territorial marshal had opened a door that couldn't be closed again, and what came through that door over the following months was a slow, thorough accounting that no amount of legal maneuvering could fully stop. He kept his freedom. There was never quite enough direct evidence to charge him with Thomas's death, a gap in the evidence that would sit in Hannah's chest like a splinter for the rest of her life, present and unresolvable. But he lost the syndicate. He lost the properties. He lost the standing in Helena that had made him untouchable for 6 years. He lost in the end the thing he had cared most about. Hannah thought that would feel more satisfying than it did. She thought about it for a while alone one evening, and then she understood she hadn't done it for satisfaction. She'd done it because Thomas had started it, and because 12 widows had deserved better, and because the truth had been sitting in a filing stack for 8 months waiting for someone to find it, and she had found it. Satisfaction was beside the point. The point was that it was done. She folded up that feeling and put it away and got on with November. Jacob was the thing she hadn't figured out how to fold up and put away. He was still next door. Of course he was still next door. He'd bought the property. He was rebuilding the herd. He had no intention of leaving, which she knew because he'd told her plainly when she'd asked him directly, 2 weeks after the hearing, in the tone of someone asking a practical question about a neighbor rather than a personal question about a person who had become very important to her. He'd looked at her for a moment and then said, "I'm not going anywhere." And the simplicity of it had done something she hadn't expected, which was make her eyes sting, which she'd dealt with by looking away and asking about his cattle situation. They had fallen into a routine that Cedar Creek had opinions about and that Hannah had stopped caring about mostly. He came for coffee on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She came for dinner on Fridays. In between, there was the natural traffic of two neighboring properties. A tool borrowed a fence, checked an unexpected problem with a well pump that required 2 people and took 3 hours and ended with both of them muddy and inexplicably in better humor than when they'd started. She had told him on the road back from the courthouse that when it was over, they would have a different conversation. About the letters, about other things. It was over now. They had not had the conversation. She was aware of this the way she was aware of a word on the tip of her tongue. Not painful, not urgent, but present. Constantly present. Available at any moment, she chose to look at it directly, which she had been choosing not to do, because choosing to look at it directly meant deciding something, and deciding something meant risk. And risk was not a thing she'd been doing casually since Thomas. She told herself she was being sensible. She told herself that more often than was probably required. The Harvest Festival came to Cedar Creek on the second Saturday of November, the way it came every year. Trestle tables outside the church hall. The smell of wood smoke and cider fiddle music that started off formal and devolved into something considerably more enthusiastic by mid-afternoon. Half the county came. It was the kind of event that felt in the Montana Territory like a collective exhale. All of us made it through another year. All of us are still here. Let's mark that before winter closes in. Hannah had not attended the festival in 2 years. She'd stayed home both times and told herself she didn't feel like it, and not examined the real reason, which was that the festival was the kind of event built for couples and families, and she had not known those 2 years how to navigate it alone, without the grief making itself too visible. This year, she went. She went partly because Margaret Hollis had told her 3 times that she ought to, which was pressure she could have resisted. She went partly because Clara Briggs had sent a note saying she'd be there, and Hannah wanted to see her face in a setting that wasn't a courthouse or a letter. She went mostly because she was tired of letting grief determine her geography, and enough was enough. She did not tell Jacob she was going. She arrived and found him already there. Of course, she found him already there. He was standing with 2 ranchers she recognized from the hearing men who had come forward in the weeks after adding their names to the territorial investigation, and he was listening to something one of them was saying with the particular quality of attention she'd come to recognize as his genuine interest rather than his polite patience, which looked different in ways she could now distinguish. He saw her the moment she arrived. She could tell by the way his posture shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but she noticed because she'd been noticing him for months. He said something brief to the ranchers and crossed the yard to her. "I didn't know you were coming," he said. "I didn't tell you." "No." He looked at her. "You look..." He stopped. "I look what... yourself," he said. "You look like yourself. More than you have since I got here." She considered this. It was one of those statements of his that landed differently than expected, not flowery, not practiced, just accurate in the way of a person who pays close attention and says what they see. "The festival was always Thomas's favorite," she said. "I've been avoiding it. And now I'm tired of avoiding things." She looked at him steadily. "I told you we'd have a conversation. When it was over. You did. It's been 6 weeks." "I know. I've been avoiding that too," she said. "I thought you should know that. I'm not..." She paused. "I'm not someone who avoids things, generally. It's been annoying." Something in his expression shifted toward that thing she'd been refusing to name, which she was going to have to name shortly, because she was apparently having this conversation right now at a harvest festival with fiddle music in the background. "What have you been avoiding specifically?" "Deciding," she said. "What I want. Which I know, actually. I've known for a while. I've been avoiding deciding whether I was going to act on knowing. He waited. He was so good at waiting. The letters, she said. When did you know? When did it stop being correspondence and become something else? He thought about it for a real moment. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately, that he actually considered it. February, he said. You wrote that surviving wasn't meant to be a permanent address. That grief was the start of something, not the end of it. He paused. I'd been telling myself for 4 years that getting through each day was enough. That wanting more than that was something I'd lost the right to. And you... He stopped. You didn't argue with me about it. You didn't tell me I was wrong. You just described it differently, like you could see something I couldn't see from where I was standing. A beat. I read that letter 20 times. I know, she said. You told me. I know I told you. They looked at each other. The fiddle music changed key somewhere behind them, moving into something slower and more deliberate. The crowd shifted and reorganized itself around tables and conversations, and the two of them stood slightly apart from all of it, which felt exactly right. I need to tell you something, he said. Her chest tightened. The investigation, he said. The marshal's office. They found Mitchell Greer. She had not expected that. Found? She stopped. Alive. Alive, he said. He's been in a mining camp in Idaho Territory for 11 months. He left the night before he was supposed to meet Thomas because someone warned him, a ranch hand who'd overheard something he shouldn't have, who felt guilty enough to ride out and warn him. He ran and kept running. He held her gaze. He didn't know Thomas died. He found out last month when the marshal located him. The world did its tilting thing. Hannah pressed her feet flat into the ground. He didn't know, she said. No. He's been running for 11 months thinking he'd abandoned Thomas and that Thomas was still alive and waiting on him. Jacob's voice was careful, which was how she knew he understood exactly what this was going to do to her. He's prepared to testify fully. He's already given a statement to the marshal. He named Blackwood directly in connection with 2 additional incidents, not Thomas but connected. The marshal thinks it's enough. Enough for what? Enough to pursue criminal charges. Not for Thomas's death directly, we may never have enough for that, but for Greer's forced disappearance, for the destruction of evidence, for the conspiracy itself. Hannah stood very still. She thought about Thomas riding out on a September morning. She thought about Greer running scared through Idaho for 11 months with guilt that wasn't entirely his to carry. She thought about the gap in the evidence that had been sitting in her chest like a splinter present, and unresolvable, she'd told herself. Maybe not entirely unresolvable, not fully, probably never fully. But something. When did you find out, she said. 3 days ago, Davies sent a wire. He paused. I wanted to tell you in person. I didn't want to knock on your door with something like this and then leave. She understood that. She appreciated it in a way that was too large for the moment, and that she tucked away for later, where it would sit with all the other things about Jacob Callahan that she'd been tucking away for months. Thank you, she said. You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to. She looked at him directly. Jacob, what I'm going to say, I need you to let me say all of it before you respond. Can you do that? Yes. I am not the same person I was before Thomas died. I know that. Some of what's different is loss, and some of it is, I grew up. In the way that hard things make you grow up, whether you're ready or not. I'm not easy. I'm stubborn and I check my own fences, and I apparently have the patience for a 6-month legal case, but not for being told what to do. And I will argue with you when I think you're wrong, which will be regularly, because you are occasionally wrong. She paused. And I have been afraid. Not of you. Of wanting something again. Of caring about someone's continued presence in the world, because I know what it feels like when that presence stops. I know exactly what that feels like. And for a long time, I thought knowing that meant I shouldn't risk it again. she breathed. I don't think that anymore. Don't think. The fiddle had stopped, or she'd stopped hearing it. The letters started something, she said. Not because you were a stranger I could be honest with, because you were someone worth being honest for. And then you were my neighbor. And then you were the man who sat at my kitchen table for 6 weeks, helping me finish what Thomas started, not because you had to, but because you decided I was worth showing up for. She held his gaze. I don't know what comes next. I'm not asking you to know either. I'm asking if you want to find out. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat. He took out an envelope. She looked at it. I wrote it 3 weeks ago, he said. I've been carrying it. He held it out. You said we'd have a different conversation. I kept thinking about how we started, that the letters were where we were most honest. I wanted to answer you the right way. She took the envelope. She opened it. His handwriting was like his speech, direct. Nothing wasted. Each word doing exactly the work it was meant to do. Hannah. I have been trying to write this letter for 3 weeks and throwing away every version because none of them say it without saying too much or too little. So I'm going to say it the way I'd say it to your face, which is directly. I didn't come to Cedar Creek looking for anything except a place to stop moving. I had spent 4 years deciding that moving was safer than staying still, and that a man who'd lost what I'd lost didn't get to want things anymore. I had gotten very good at that. I thought I'd keep being good at it. Then I got a letter from a woman who said that tending a living thing through winter made a person feel less alone. And something in me that had been locked for 4 years opened up before I even understood what was happening. By February, I knew what was happening. By the time I moved to the property next door, which I did not do, because I knew it was you. I want that on record, I was already more than halfway gone. You asked me once in a letter in March if I thought people who had loved and lost could build something new without betraying what they'd had before. I told you I thought they could. I meant it. I mean it more now. I am not asking you to replace anything. I am not asking you to forget anyone. I am asking very simply if you will let me stay. Not next door, not as a neighbor, here, in the parts of your life you let people into. You once told me that surviving was the start of something. I think you were right. I'd like to find out what it's the start of. J.C. Hannah finished reading. She folded the letter. She looked at the man standing in front of her, the man who had arrived as a stranger and a letter writer, and a neighbor and a partner who had sat at her kitchen table and fixed her fence posts and stood beside her in a courtroom and told her the truth, even when it was complicated, and waited patiently and without pressure for her to be ready. Jacob, she said. Yes. You said you'd let me answer before you said anything else. I said I'd let you speak first. You've spoken. It's my turn. Your letter was your turn. The letter was preliminary. The almost laugh was in his voice. The actual answer requires an actual response. She looked at him. Then answer. I already did, he said. 3 weeks ago in writing. You're holding it. He met her eyes. But if you need me to say it out loud, yes. Whatever you're asking, yes, without reservation. The tightness in her chest released. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way ice releases in spring gradually by degrees until you look up one morning and realize the river is moving again. You understand what you're agreeing to, she said. I've described myself accurately. I'm not going to become easier. I know, he said. I read every letter. And you still, Hannah. He said her name the way he'd learned to say it, direct, unhurried, like it mattered to get it right. I drove cattle for 4 years to avoid standing still. Standing still next to you is the first time being still has felt like something I chose rather than something I was hiding from. He paused. Yes, all of it. However it looks, yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something she had not done in 2 years and 3 months, and however many days since she'd stopped counting. She reached out and took his hand. Not tentatively, not with reservation. With the same directness she'd brought to fence posts and legal hearings and strong boxes, and the truth with both hands, and her full attention, and the complete clear-eyed knowledge of what she was choosing and why. His hand closed around hers. Around them, the festival continued, fiddle music starting up again, the smell of cider and wood smoke. Clara Briggs's laugh, somewhere to the left. Margaret Hollis's voice carrying over everything, the way it always did. Cedar Creek, Montana territory, on a November evening, carrying on with the ordinary business of living. She had a letter in her pocket and a man's hand in hers, and her farm was whole, and her husband's evidence had finally found a judge, and Mitchell Greer was alive in Idaho, and the apple trees were going to need attention before the first hard frost. She thought about the woman who had written to a stranger about orchards and loneliness, and making yourself feel less alone. She thought about what that woman had been asking for underneath the words about apple trees. Not rescue. She'd never needed rescue. Not company, exactly. She'd had company and managed without it. She had been asking in the careful sideways language of a private person who doesn't know how to ask directly whether there was still room in the world for her to want something. Whether the parts of her that had been frost-damaged and dark were still capable of bearing anything. The answer, it turned out, was yes. She had learned it from the letters. She had lived it in the 4 months since a pie hit a porch floor, and a stranger said her name like he already knew it. She stood in the November air with Jacob Callahan's hand in hers, and Cedar Creek around her, and the whole of winter ahead, and the whole of spring after that, and she was not surviving anymore. She was living. That was the difference. That was all of it. And she had earned every inch of it.